What if history and technological development had taken a different turn after World War I? What if instead of drifting toward electronics, digital networks, and the internet, humanity doubled down on mechanical engineering, diesel power, and heavy industry? Then we might have been living in a dieselpunk world. In more official language, Dieselpunk is a retrofuturistic subgenre of speculative fiction built around the technological and cultural spirit of roughly the 1910s to the 1950s. It takes the real-world industrial and social energy from that era and simply asks, what if this kept going further than it ever did in reality? Instead of moving into the atomic age and then onto microchips and clean digital interfaces, Dieselpunk imagines a future that stays rooted in combustion, pressure, and practicality. Engines, turbines, armored vehicles, factory lines, and experimental aircraft become the icons of this universe. You don't see soft glowing touchscreens. You see riveted metal, pressure gauges, patched pipes, and machinery that looks like it's been repaired more times than anyone can count. Stylistically, a typical dieselpunk world pulls from noir sensibilities. It's stylish but not delicate. Compared to steampunk, which loves Victorian optimism and whimsical invention, dieselpunk feels more grounded and less romantic. Here, things aren't invented just because it would be fun to build them. They're engineered because the situation demands it. Function becomes first. If anything beautiful emerges, it usually follows industrial logic more than artistic whim. And that's exactly what I personally find compelling about Dieselpunk. It keeps the atmosphere of the past, the clothes, the architecture, the posters, the music, but pushes the technology just enough to feel like an alternate timeline. Everything is worn imperfect and little harsh. In the end, Dieselpunk is a balance between what once was and what could have been. It takes the spirit of a very real era and asks, what if the world stayed on this track just a bit longer? And to see why that actually makes sense, why the tech, the mood, the visuals feel so believable, we need to go back to where it all starts, to the real history that inspired it. If you strip Dieselpunk down to its bones, it's basically one big historical thought experiment. What if, after World War I, instead of drifting toward electronics and the digital revolution, the world doubled down on fuel, steel, and industrial engineering? What would our cities look like? What would every day feel like? What would our world be like? To answer that, we have to step back into the actual history the genre leans on. Not to memorize dates, but to understand the mood of those decades and why they lend themselves so naturally to this kind of world building. The story starts in the late 1910s. Industrialization was no longer an idea, it was reality. Factories were expanding, assembly lines were increasingly efficient, and machines were stepping into roles previously filled by people or animals. Mechanized warfare had just made its brutal debut. Tanks, early aircraft, heavy artillery. Engineering wasn't just theory anymore, it was rolling across battlefields. Then came the 1920s. On the surface, this decade looked glamorous and optimistic, especially in big cities. Jazz, nightlife, Art Deco architecture, everything felt like it was leaning toward progress. Buildings climbed higher, designs got bolder, and the world projected confidence. But underneath all that shine, the system wasn't as stable as it looked. That tension, refined style layered over structural fragility, is something Dieselpunk borrows heavily. It loves that contrast between polished design and a world that could crack at any moment. The 1930s broke that illusion. The Great Depression hit, and suddenly the world of industry wasn't about endless growth. It was about survival. Factories still ran, but innovation shifted. People repaired instead of replacing. Materials were used. Machines stayed in service longer than intended because they had to. This mindset, make it last, make it work, even if it's not perfect, became a huge part of Dieselpunk's philosophy. World War II then pushed industrial capacity into overdrive. Machines got bigger, faster, and more specialized. Entire economies were organized around production. Tanks, aircraft, experimental prototypes, you name it. Dieselpunk takes that momentum and refuses to let it fade. Instead of giving way to digital systems and space-age ideas, the world stays grounded in combustion engines, heavy machinery, and industrial-scale solutions. After the war, history took a different path. The early Cold War years pushed technology toward nuclear power, electronics, early computers, and later digital systems. That's the timeline we know. Dieselpunk deliberately rejects that shift. It stays anchored in mechanical engineering. Engines get more advanced, systems become more powerful, and structures grow more complex. So Dieselpunk doesn't rewrite history from scratch. It just refuses to follow the branch we actually took. The term dieselpunk is usually traced back to 2001, when Lewis Pollock used it to describe his role-playing game Children of the Sun. But the look and feel of Dieselpunk existed long before anyone agreed on the name. A great example is Crimson Skies from around 2000. It doesn't call itself Dieselpunk, but if you look at it now, air pirates, bomber planes, retrofuturistic aviation, pulpy alternate history, it's basically a Dieselpunk textbook before the term was popularized. You can see the similar DNA in older films, illustrations, pulp covers, and concept art that mixed industrial history with speculative tech, even if nobody knew what to call it at the time. So anyway, the genre was already out there in pieces. The terminology simply arrived later, giving fans and creators a convenient label for a style they had been enjoying for years. Every punk genre has its own visual DNA. Cyberpunk throws neon, implants, chrome limbs, androids, and flying cars at you from every angle. Steampunk showcases Victorian elegance, brass machinery, car sets, goggles, ornate weaponry, and all the romantic extravagance of the Industrial Revolution. But Dieselpunk, it has a very different footprint. Here we get Art Deco and streamlined modern, we get espionage, propaganda, war themes, industrial might, and cities that feel tense, almost like they're always waiting for the next conflict, the next decree from the regime, or the next strike from the resistance. And of course, the most iconic part of Dieselpunk world building is machinery. Massive, unapologetic machinery. Civilian cars, industrial machines, zeppelins, aircraft, tanks, artillery. Those aren't just props, they are calling cards of the genre. Just imagine walking down the street and seeing 1930s or 1950s Art Deco roadsters, but with futuristic detailing. The way Captain Nema's car was redesigned in the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. That's Dieselpunk design logic. Start with something real, then extend it into something impossible, but still mechanical. And that brings us to zeppelins and aircraft. Zeppelins are basically the birthmark of Dieselpunk. Big, steel, militarized, sometimes flying fortresses. And the best part, these giant vessels don't even need to be the biggest machines in the world. Engineering is your playground here. If the idea is mechanically grounded, it belongs. Then we get to the heart of every Dieselpunk fantasy, war machines. This is where designers go absolutely wild. Tanks the size of buildings, artillery with rotating multi-barrel systems, walkers with human pilots inside, spider-like assault vehicles firing cannons from their mechanical link. If you can merge diesel engines, weaponry, and animal or humanoid silhouettes, congratulations, you have created a perfectly valid Dieselpunk war machine that could overthrow a government or annihilate a resistance base. People, of course, dress like they belong to the world built around this tech. Fashion takes inspiration from the early mid-20th century clothing, but you also see industrial influence everywhere. Finally, there's a core aesthetic foundation that cannot be removed, because once it's gone, Dieselpunk is no longer Dieselpunk. As I said before, the entire visual influence of this genre comes from the 1910s through the 1950s. Art Deco and streamlined modern are the most obvious ones, but they are not alone.
You are not alone.
There were other art movements happening at the same time: Futurism, Constructivism, and Bauhaus. And these movements are just as important. In fact, they are the reason why Dieselpunk cities look the way they do. If you're old enough, if you have seen the city in Metropolis, that's not an accident. That visual language came directly from these movements, and Dieselpunk borrows it heavily. Not because it looks cool, but because it perfectly fits how Dieselpunk society functions. Take Constructivism, for example. In real life, it wasn't just an art style. It was used as a propaganda tool, especially in the Soviet Union after the Russian Revolution. Big shapes, strong lines, simple forms, no softness. Everything was designed to push people toward industrial progress, discipline, and collective effort. That's extremely important for Dieselpunk, where visuals are often used to control people, glorify production, and maintain authoritarian or totalitarian regimes. The city itself becomes propaganda. Then there is Bauhaus, which is almost the opposite in tone, but just as important. Its main idea was simple: form follows function. No unnecessary decoration. If something exists, it exists for a reason. And that is exactly how Dieselpunk worlds are built. Buildings, machines, vehicles, everything is designed around purpose, durability, and functionality first. Nothing is there just to look pretty. Art Deco, on the other hand, is visual expression of industrial confidence. It's literally a celebration of machines, progress, and modernity. Even though Dieselpunk isn't about luxury, that glamorous feeling is still there. You see it in the vertical lines of buildings designed to make cities look taller, more powerful, more dominant. Art Deco makes industry look heroic. And then comes streamlined modern, the evolution of the latter idea. Instead of vertical while power, it focuses on speed and movement. Long horizontal lines, smooth curves, shapes inspired by trains, planes and engines. This is where Dieselpunk vehicles get their look. So when you put all of this together, you start to realize something important. Dieselpunk isn't just old tech with guns. It's a carefully built visual system. Every line, shape and structure comes from real movements that were already obsessed with industry, function, power and progress. We can play with these elements, we can exaggerate them, but some things have to stay untouched. The visual logic, the industrial mindset, the way cities communicate power through architecture. We can remix them to build new cities and worlds. But is it really the most important thing in this genre? Of course not. Art movements are responsible for visual distinction and aesthetic pleasure. Yes, they shape how Dieselpunk looks. But what truly defines the genre, what makes it feel heavy and believable, is something deeper. And that is social structure. Dieselpunk is speculative fiction rooted in real historical events, and its era falls roughly between the early and mid-20th century. And a lot happened during that time. But the most influential and notorious events were World War I, World War II, and the very beginning of the Cold War. These moments are crucial if you want to understand why Dieselpunk worlds so often fall under authoritarian rule. War, by its very nature, leads to martial law. And martial law, whether people support it or not, suspends and even severely restricts civil liberties. In this sense, war is not only a cause of oppression, but also a convenient justification for it. Freedom can be limited temporarily, always framed as a necessary sacrifice for safety, for victory, for the future of the nation, always for the people, of course. And this is one of the core reasons why freedom is so often oppressed in Dieselpunk world. We can argue endlessly about whether it's justified or not, but that's not the point. The point is understanding how and why this oppression becomes normalized, because it does teach us something. First, the state appeals to patriotism, to duty, to fear. People are told that restrictions are necessary for their own good, for their children, for the survival of the homeland. And under constant pressure, especially during wartime, most people accept this logic. It feels natural, it feels responsible. And once that mindset settles in, governments can gradually tighten control, limit freedom further, and pass laws that would be unthinkable in times of peace. And then comes one of the most powerful tools of all, something humanity never truly encountered before at that scale. By the 1910s and 1920s, mass media was emerging. Cinema, radio, news, later television. This was a revolution. And in Dieselpunk worlds, media becomes a critical instrument of control. In Dieselpunk, propaganda isn't occasional, it's constant. Posters on walls, speeches on the radio, films glorifying industry, sacrifice and obedience, public celebrations of productivity and loyalty. At first people notice it, then they get used to it, and eventually they stop seeing it at all. They don't feel oppressed, they feel guided, supported, united. When propaganda shapes reality itself, freedom doesn't need to be violently taken. People give it up voluntarily. And this is especially effective because society hasn't yet developed any defense against it. Just like a new virus entering an organism, mass media arrives before people have antibodies. Even today, many still believe information blindly. Influencers, headlines, narratives, without checking facts. Now imagine the 1910s or 1920s, when nobody even suspected this kind of manipulation was possible. Add to this the industrial nature of Dieselpunk society. Massive factories, energy grids, transportation networks, war production. All of it requires coordination, discipline, and centralized control. Efficiency becomes more important than individuality. In a world that runs on machines, people are expected to function like components. And this is why authoritarian systems feel so natural in Dieselpunk. Not because the genre is inherently evil or dystopian, but because its logic follows history. It asks, what if our history never happened? What if society stayed locked in permanent mobilization? And what if something like this happens now?